Good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, wherever you're coming live with us from. My name is Brenda Bailey Hughes, and I'm happy to welcome you to Learn Plus. If you're joining me, please in the chat let us know where you're calling in from, or phoning in from, videoing in from today. I'm in the Midwest of the United States, Bloomington, Indiana, and it is a rainy, gray, gross day here. And I'm looking for all of you and your sunshine to cheer up this gray and dreary day. We'll take gray and dreary over snow, I suppose, or massive windstorms. For those of you who are repeat offenders, those of you who come see the LinkedIn Lives with me each month, you'll know that last month, Bloomington was under a wind advisory during my live. And sure enough, as soon as I'd introduced my guest and asked about one question, poof, my whole power structure went out. And having a great guest was awesome because she just kept talking. So we've got Windsor, Ontario here. We've got North Carolina, which is sunny. Yes, lovely. London, all rainy and gray. You're used to it though, Maria. No, I'm just kidding. Connecticut, we've got Anna Deeds here. She's also a Bloomington faculty member here, so she knows, works with both me and Kathy, and has been a guest here on my Learn Plus. Got Illinois and Ohio and Utah, Phoenix, Arizona. Go Hoosiers! Well, Megan, thank you. From a sporting and athletic perspective, the Hoosiers had a really rough weekend. This is basketball territory for those of you unfamiliar with the Midwest. We play a lot of basketball, and the teams that at the academic unit institution where I teach, Indiana University, did not fare well in the rounds of the tourney. We've got Delhi, India here, California, good. I bet you're sunny too. Amsterdam, wonderful. Poland is here. Qatar, thank you. Argentina. Kelly King from Bloomington. Welcome, Kelly. Good to see you. Manchester, mix of gray and sunny. We've got Marseille. Great. Thomas, glad you're here. Last time I was in Marseille was almost a year ago. It was April of last year, and it was so cold last year. India also, love your trainings. Thank you, Sunny. So glad you're here. And see, Sunny's even bringing the sun with the name there. We get Sunny right there. Molly's here as well. So glad to see all of you. Well, our content today, and as always, I'm going to introduce a fabulous guest. We're going to talk content for a while, and then I'll wrap us with one specific training technique or a coaching tool that you can use if you're an L&D professional, if you're a coach, if you're a team leader, and you're looking for ways to take what we talk about today and expand it beyond your own learning. And the topic today is audience analysis, or really tailoring your messages to your audience. And when I say audience, I don't necessarily mean a presentation audience, although that certainly would be relevant, but just your conversational partner. So the people that you're in a meeting with, the people that you're having that difficult conversation with, the people that you're leading the team meeting for, all of those people are your audience in the language that Kathy and I will use today. And one of the messages that I send most often when I am doing communication trainings, communication courses, or even one-on-one coaching is that the secret to great communication is audience, audience, audience. It's know your audience, tailor to your audience. And then I always laugh because it's not really a secret. I mean, if you've read anything about communication, you know that you have to be audience centric. And yet when I watch people present, when I dig into what it is they're doing when they're presenting, or they're leading meetings, or they're making decisions about what should be on an agenda, I don't see evidence always of being audience centric, even though if I said, do you think audience tailoring is important? Oh, yes, 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 yes. But then it doesn't actually come out in our actions sometimes. I think it's easy to get caught up more in, here's what I want to say, here's what I want to talk about in the meeting. And we put a lot of emphasis on that instead of thinking, what does my audience need to hear? And that's a subtle but also huge leap in our thinking. And so if you leave today with nothing else, and you make that switch in your mindset, not what do I want to say, but what do they need to hear, you will have fundamentally shifted the way you approach communication. So when we're thinking about audiences, it will be helpful for me and Kathy to know, who are your audiences? Who are you likely to interact with on a given day? And so this can go in the chat here. Oh, good. Now we've got Brazil is in the house. Egypt is here. Jamaica is here. Saudi Arabia. We'd already had one from Poland, and Jay is here too. Hi, Jay. So good to see you. So what audiences, who are you likely to interact with? So for example, on any given day, I'm likely to talk to maybe a junior colleague. So another faculty member. So this could be someone who's just brilliant in our field, but maybe has less experience as an educator than I do. So there's an interesting dynamic there. I might talk with a colleague. I might talk with a dean or one of my associate deans. So somebody that's has power dynamics over me, which changes the conversational flow. I might talk to a client, and that's another interesting place because I am the subject matter expert on communication, but the client would know more about their organization and the culture and the functionality of their business. And so they're an expert and I'm an expert, and they're kind of my boss and I'm kind of their mentor. So that's an interesting kind of audience. I might talk to a first-year college student in one of my classes. I might talk to a 5-year-old grandchild of mine. So those would be, really radically different audiences, but all people that I could interact with on any given day. So let's see yours. We've got recruiters and prospective employers because Elizabeth is on the job hunt. Great to know. Shelby talks to clients, kids, and husband, all totally different types of communication. Yes, absolutely. So give us some more of the types of, what are the relationships with whom you interact on a daily basis? Business owners or business students. Thanks, Kelly. These are great. And this will help Kathy and I, again, kind of understand who is it you're interacting with and how do you make that conversation go well. So I keep talking about Kathy. Let's get her in here. Today's guest is Kathy Fisher. She is going to be here to talk about specific questions we might ask our audience, conversational partners, ways we increase our empathetic awareness of who it is we're speaking with. Kathy is on the faculty of the nationally ranked Kelley School of Business, where we teach. She's an award-winning teacher. I know that she's received our Trustees Award, which is an award granted only to the top 6% of all faculty. So you've got the cream of the crop here with Kathy. She's been awarded the Mumford Excellence in Extraordinary Teaching. She's been awarded the Distinction in the Practice of Diversity and Inclusion Award, which will really inform how she thinks about audience tailoring in a really wonderful way. Before coming to Kelley and getting into teaching or taking on a teaching role, she's had roles in recruiting, in marketing, and in advertising. And so she just brings a wealth of both academic and corporate experience to us today. So Kathy, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. Hello.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
It's great to have you. So you're seeing the comments here and all the varied kinds of audiences our group talks with: talent acquisition, project managers, leadership updates.
Absolutely. Some students, some colleagues, some CEOs. Certainly our different audiences require different messages, right? So this is a great topic.
Yeah, I love this topic. And like I said, it's always what I hound when I'm teaching communication. Like this is, if you only learn the one thing, this is it. This has got to be it. But in a more nuanced, well, let's start there. When did you kind of come to the realization that, whoa, this really matters? I mean, we read it in the textbooks. We know it at this level, but when did it sort of, boom, sink in for you?
Yeah, well, I love what Shelby was talking about from the difference between clients and even family and her husband, right? So I think just by human nature, we know audience analysis from a really young age. We know which grandparent to go to or parent to go to get the extra candy or the extra cookie from a very young age. We know that we have to make observations and take in our information to get what we want. And I actually mentioned this morning with a group of Kelley School of Business faculty that there's a very famous quote by Ken Hamer, the former presentation manager of AT&T. And he says, designing a presentation without the audience in mind is like writing a love letter and addressing it to whom it may concern. And when you really think about that and let that sink in, we have so many of us experienced presentations that just kind of felt like they were copy and pasted from another client or from another pitch. And that doesn't feel good. We want to feel like a presentation or communication in general, whether it's a presentation or even an interview, that's not like a pre-boxed thing.
Oh,
And
yeah.
so when I feel like I first saw it sink in was earlier in my career. As you mentioned, I worked in advertising and I worked mainly in two industries, travel and real estate. And I worked for a pretty large media company. And admittedly, they kind of made my job easy. I had research folks who helped me, marketing folks who helped me tailor my presentations to the client, but they were pretty similar. I was in a boardroom, I was in front of an ad agency, those kinds of things. And so while I knew how to tailor those specifically to the client, I didn't have to make as many adjustments as when I moved to Indiana and started working for a smaller media company. And in that company, my clients ranged in size in an industry. So in the morning, I might be pitching in a boardroom in a suit to an NBA team. And then in the afternoon, I'd have to almost do a costume change, bring a printed slide deck, or have my iPad with me to walk through a mom and pop shop in a back room that was their office, right? And so I think that position really, it clicked with me that audience analysis is not just the research that we do on their LinkedIn or their company website, but really taking in all of the aspects of our environment, what we know about them, and what they want to and would like to hear about.
Yeah, I loved your example of, well, thank you for sharing that. It's the moment it sunk in for you is like standing in a back room with an iPad or a printed out deck because there's no projector, there's no high tech here. Yeah, a suit would look ridiculous. Yeah, really making those changes to your own. And I think that, well, I want to come back and talk about authenticity there in a minute, but I loved your example of very young age, people start figuring out, go to this parent for that, go to that parent if I want to ask this. I am shocked at how often I will open an email, the kind of the cut and paste, copy paste presentations. I see it in emails. I'll open an
Sure.
email and think, why am I even getting this? Who are they talking to? It's certainly not me. I don't even know what this is about. And maybe if I persist and read through the first 2 or 3 paragraphs, which honestly, we don't very
Yeah.
often, if we don't see that immediate relevancy to us, we just hit delete or move on. But if I do persist, sometimes somewhere I will find a nugget and think, oh, okay, maybe this is why I'm getting this email, but we should never make our readers or our listeners work hard to figure out, why am I at this meeting? Why am I reading this email? That is not audience tailoring.
Yeah. And I think it's just human nature that we all kind of want to feel like special, right? So when we are given a presentation or we're sitting in an interview and it's very clear that these were prepackaged answers or that people aren't really considering our needs or what we care about, it kind of feels like a waste of our time.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's a good point. We have people here who will be in the interview circuit, and we get that answer crafted. It's a great story, and we tell it so well. But if we're sharing it when it doesn't really answer the question that we were asked, the interviewers will hear that as sort of that's not what we even asked. How is that about us? That's not about our corporation. I think that's interesting. So when you changed out of the suit at the boardroom and you changed into your jeans and hoodie for the next conversation or whatever, how did you, I mean, how do we sort of connect being authentic as a communicator and still flexing our communication? So if I had seen you in both of those settings, and maybe in one you're a little more direct and your articulation is crisper, and in the other you're a little more relaxed, you're a little more folksy, even if I
Mhm.
dare use that word,
Mhm.
you spend more time just chatting about the kids and what's in the weather and those things. Would anyone be able to see that and say, well, Kathy's being fake because
Mm.
she's this way there and she's that way there? How do we reconcile authenticity and flexing to tailor to an audience? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of that has to do with really, and we'll, I think, talk a little bit about this in a little bit later, but really having a understanding of who you are and what you value and how you connect with your audience. I don't think you should ever be someone you're not, right? So I think that when I was in my suit in the boardroom, I was still Kathy, and I was still Kathy when I was more casually with a client, or even just like networking at a happy hour with clients, right? It's doing the homework to figure out what your client or your audience needs, meeting them where they're at so that they feel comfortable. And so part of that has to do with asking the right questions, having an idea of who they are, how they prefer to receive information. Because I think that that is not being inauthentic. I think that's being respectful of the people that you're communicating with.
I think that's a key difference that I wanted for our listeners to really to wrap our heads around, because I think there is that sort of, well, wait, I can't change how I show up. That would be inauthentic. And I follow these people that are in our room with us today and in the show with us, and they're authentic, genuine humans. And so that's a real, I feel that tension sometimes for them to say, but wait, if I show up this way one place and this way in another, that's not genuine. But I love your framing of it. No, it's respectful is what it is. You wouldn't show up for this situation the same way you show up for this situation. So we don't show up for this group of listeners the same way we show up for this group of listeners.
Sure. And even sometimes when I talk with clients or even students about the kind of language we use and how we relate to our audience to make sure that we're connecting with them, we have an understanding of what they know, what they might need to know, and making sure that we're connecting using the correct terminology and language. I tell some of my undergraduate students, this isn't me telling you that you shouldn't use bigger words or you shouldn't use industry words, but what that sometimes means is we need to do more digging and more practice so that we feel comfortable with it and it comes out authentic. So it doesn't sound like we are not true to who we are, but we sound like we know what we're talking about when we're speaking.
And hopefully because we do know what we're talking about.
Exactly. Of course.
Right. I had been working with we were talking about kind of how do you know when someone gets it, when at this level they get it at their heart and their belly level, that audience analysis matters. And I remember I was working with a client. His executives had asked me to work with him because he made a lot of executive level pitches that were just not hitting. They just were not hitting home. And they said, could you work with him? Because he's so smart. We think he's got great talent, but his presentations are kind of a mess, or even not even formal presentations, but he's coming to the board prepared to lead a conversation. And, he's off into the weeds on things that are irrelevant to them or way too detailed, maybe way above their knowledge level.
Sure.
And so we'd had meeting after meeting where we're working on a specific upcoming conversation. And he would come back and I'd say, no, you're still not there. This still isn't really what I think your audience needs. And his frustration level was rising. I could feel it, right? And then at one point, he finally kind of almost in an outburst said, Brenda, I am really sick of working on this. Like, I have put over 20 hours in the last week into this one conversation prep. And into my research and into my analysis and into my PowerPoint. And I'm kind of sick of it. And I said, 20 hours, huh? Well, okay, here's what you owe me. If you put 20 hours of time into your research, your analysis, and your presentation, you owe me 20 hours of research on your audience. And he went, huh? What? I said, yeah, you need to do 20 hours of research on the audience. Okay, fine. And you could tell he thought it was kind of stupid, but he did it. He did it because he was such a smart guy, such a good learner, so open to really wanting to make this change. So, I mean, he found out how board members had voted on previous issues that were relevant to the issue. He talked to anybody who knew the different board members to understand what they were about and how they thought. He, did the social media searches, looked up their LinkedIn. Where did they come from? What schools are they from? What's their background? How are they trained? I'll tell you what, Kathy, he came into that next practice and just nailed it. It was perfect. And it was, and when he finished, I just kind of sat there. I mean, I was almost a little verschlepped. I was a little like emotional because he'd made such a change. And he goes, I've got it, don't I? And I said, yes, Eric, you've got it. You know,
Yay!
yes. It was this really cool moment. So anyway, all
Yeah.
right, we've got some questions coming in here. Let's see. I was always worried. Yeah, Shelby worries about authenticity and respect. Glad we could to how to mold your conversation when listener is not interested or not into it. How do you make someone inclined through your conversation? So we're going to talk about, well, let's just jump there. Kathy, we know that audiences tend to fall into a couple of different buckets, if you will. Yeah, we get hostile audiences or resistant audiences. I think the one that Manan is talking about is what we tend to call the neutral audience, or maybe even
Apathetic.
yeah, kind of an apathetic audience. I'm not against you. I'm not for you. I just don't really care. And then kind of that friendly or ready audience. They do like your message. So how do you speak differently to the, what are some strategies you use to lean into those different types of listeners or receivers that we might be running into?
Sure, absolutely. I also wanted to quickly comment on Jay made a comment there about understanding when a speaker or a communicator knows their limitations, and that shows their humanity and trust with the person. I think that that's absolutely speaks to that authenticity piece, and and that humanizes the conversation, right? Presentations, pitches, interviews, all of these different types of communication is a sender and a receiver. So it's not a one-way street. And I think the more that we can humanize ourselves and be humble, that creates the opportunity for a relationship. And then hopefully that leads to us achieving our goals at the end. So I think that was a really great point. I just wanted to note that while I saw that. I do think that we do see these three different pockets of audiences: the hostile, the apathetic or neutral, and the friendly. And they certainly all have different definitions and also goals that we want to get out of them. So certainly our friendly audience already agrees with us and our subject matter. So they generally find us to be a credible source. And those are always really nice and fun because you're really just kind of reinforcing the message and building up to finally getting them to call to action to something. And so what I would say, actually, before I jump to the next one, is that knowing these ahead of time is helpful in your preparation, and sometimes asking the questions, and you might know this based on whether they have to be at your presentation or they don't, those kinds of things. But knowing whether they're a hostile, apathetic, or friendly audience, that sometimes changes in the middle of your presentation. You might think you're going into this easy peasy presentation or conversation, and then all of a sudden they throw a wrench in it, and they're kind of getting a little apathetic or maybe even a little hostile in and giving you a little bit more pushback. So we do always need to adapt. And that's the biggest thing with audience analysis that I think is important to remember is it is constantly happening. It's the work you do ahead of time. It's the work you're doing while you're listening or while you're conversing to adapt and meet the needs of the person on the other side. In terms of neutral or apathetic, as the question was kind of getting at, they're not normally always initially interested in your subject matter, and maybe they actually lack some knowledge. So your point or your goal with that kind of audience is really to help them answer the why should I care question, right? So you want to confirm why they should care and kind of increase their knowledge or understanding on that topic. So that's more of the goal with a neutral audience, is understanding what they know and what they might need to know to take them to that next level. The last one is hostile. And
yeah, that's the trickiest one, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And hostile is funny because I feel like whenever I talk about this with clients or with students, they picture somebody like throwing tomatoes or somebody being really rude. And you might see hostile in different ways with body language, with what you know ahead of time. So maybe you know you're walking into a room with a client that is resistant to your message. I know that in my career, there were plenty of clients I went to year after year, knowing that the likelihood of them saying yes to my ad campaign was pretty much no, but you keep pushing, right? So with that, they might disagree with the position or even take issue with you. So part of that goal in that audience is more to get them to listen to your view, stress common ground, right? Making sure that you're kind of hitting on those things that you know that you might have in common, that you can kind of weave into this to become a neutral or friendly down the line. Whenever I talk about this with groups, I say, for me, with a hostile audience, my goal is to get the second meeting. Sometimes I know I'm not getting the ask on that first meeting, but I want to move them from hostile to neutral. I want to move them to want to know more.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to sort of summarize those three buckets. I'm remembering a situation where I was coaching a client who had been asked by his company to deliver a bad news message to multiple groups. So they made a major change to the benefits package, and they had done their audience analysis enough to know most people in the company are not going to receive this message very well. And so then they felt sorry for the poor guy who had to go to be the bearer of the bad, like kill the messenger kind of thing they were worried about. So they had asked me to work with him to make the messaging as good as it could be, given that it was bad news. And so he and I worked through really, planning a message for that hostile or resistant group. So we did, a lot of the things that Kathy was talking about. We said, don't expect them to be cheering for you on the way out the door, but hope that they don't all, that it's not mass mutiny, that they will kind of get on board and go through the steps that they needed to do to make this transition. Let's just try to move the dial a little bit, kind of. So setting his expectations. We practiced lots of how do you manage a hostile Q&A where people are not even really asking you a question. They're just criticizing, but they're trying to frame it like a question because it's Q&A. And how you can just, the response to that is don't answer a question that's not a question. Instead, just empathize. Just say, yes, I know this is not the best news, and reinforce your own message. So we practiced that. I even did mock tears. If you got someone so upset about this change that they cried, could my client respond on the fly to someone in tears? And so we practiced and practiced and practiced. And he started going around to the different regions to share this message. And he would call back after each one and report in. And for the most part, they were going well. I mean, as well as could be expected. And the messaging was happening like we had expected it to. And then one afternoon I got a call and he was like, oh my gosh, Brenda, I totally blew it. They just went crazy. And I was like, what happened? It's been going so well. I don't understand. He said, well, I've been to 3 divisions already. So the word is out. And this region had already found out about the change. Their manager had talked them through it. They had actually kind of made peace with it. So they were a neutral or friendly audience. He walked in and used the same approach. He didn't pick that up. And so, one of the ways to deal with a resistant audience is to just go ahead and speak the objections, put that out there. Don't, like we say, address the elephant in the room, meaning don't tiptoe around and pretend that there aren't some negatives to this. Say what they are and what our workarounds are for the negative implications. So he came in with that approach, like, okay, here's what's got to change. Here are the concerns I suspect you will have. And so in the audience's mind, they're thinking, oh my gosh, we kind of thought this benefits thing was going to be okay, but they've sent somebody from corporate all the way out here to our region to tell us how bad it is. And it turned a friendly audience into a hostile audience because he didn't adapt on the fly, which is what you had said. We've got to stay tuned in. They could switch in a moment. He should have realized that this is a different kind of audience, or, ask a few more questions up front. So I've always remembered that story as a way of acknowledging the clarity and the different strategies between hostile, neutral, and friendly audiences, but also always reminding myself, I don't know 100% until I'm in the room and asking questions and deeply listening to my audience. But yeah, I think it's a good summation then, listeners, that if you have who you suspect is a friendly audience, your goal is to get action. So don't spend tons and tons of time talking about what your recommendation is or what the change is and all the reasons to go through it. It's a friendly audience. They're already on board with you. Just Spend your time, your energy on, here are the next steps. Here's the next, and make those steps easy, tangible and easy for them to take. That's what we do with friendly audiences. And like Kathy was saying, with the neutral audience, it's all about, why should they care? What's in it for them? You're motivating them to be intrigued and interested. And yeah, with your hostile or resistant audiences, move the dial a little bit, get the second meeting, as Kathy said. I always say, even if I plant seeds of doubt, if they're absolutely sure they're right and they're absolutely sure I'm wrong, if I can just plant a seed of doubt, if you start to doubt that I'm totally wrong and that you're totally right, I feel like mission accomplished. I have done a good job for meeting number one.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that what I'm about to say is about presentations, but it applies to all communication. And one thing that I always tell my clients is that it's not a presentation, it's a presentation. So you need to be present in the moment of your presentation and understand and take in all of that information, because like your example said, they weren't really capturing what was happening in the room. They weren't reading the room to understand that actually they were fine. They kind of dug themselves a grave.
They really did. Oh, it was so sad. It's a great lesson learned for me as a consultant and for him, I think. So we've got some great comments here. Sunny commented that hostile audiences mostly need acknowledgement. They want to keep their opinion on the top. Yeah, just kind of that. Yeah, we hear you. That empathy goes so far. Thank you for that. You should watch congressional hearings for master classes on how not to handle hostile audiences. Yeah. How do we handle folks that always seem to want to pull out the negative in situations, but fail to identify the positives in any situation? I'm sure Quentin's just dreaming up a hypothetical, has had no experience here whatsoever. No. Okay, that's a great question. Let us ponder that for a minute. They want to pull out the negative, but fail to identify the positives.
I mean, I think that kind of gets at what you were talking about in the Q&A, the people who are just using it as an opportunity to air grievances. And so I think that's also an opportunity to ask questions back and get them to unravel that a little bit more, so that you can maybe address it in a different way. Because if they're just wanting to hear the same thing over and over again, then you kind of have to keep searching for that nugget to be able to make that connection or to shift the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Quentin, I have a class in the LinkedIn library called Being Positive in the Workplace. And one of the videos in that specifically addresses, what do you do if you're not the person experiencing negativity? You're a fairly positive person in the workplace, but you're constantly having to interact with someone who takes a pretty negative perspective. And that video might be really useful, but I'll summarize a little bit of it. Some of it is starting with empathy, because as one of our other, I think it was Sunny commented, sometimes it's just, they just need to know they're being heard. And so just a simple paraphrase back of what they've said sometimes will make them feel like, okay, I'm still not happy about this, but at least you get me. And so I can get off the negative and shift gears a little bit. Sometimes that's my starting point. If that doesn't work, then I do shift to more of the actually introducing the positives myself. It doesn't seem like I can get them there, but I can state the positives of the day, of the event, of the project, of the upcoming change that we're going to experience. And then honestly, Quentin, at some point, my advice is some separation. That negativity can take such a toll on your own emotional energy and well-being, that there just comes a point where, to the extent that you can, you take fewer meetings with that person. You work in a space that's a little more isolated from them. That's the more dramatic of the experiences, but I think that is a better choice than saying, I just have to take in all this negativity all the time. And if you can't create an actual physical separation, I talk about mental separation, and I use the shields up metaphor. Like I have this force field that I put up when I'm in this person's presence that emotionally separates me from them, so that I'm not absorbing that negativity in a way that's going to hurt my own outlook on life, my own joy, my own performance, which negativity can affect performance. So yeah, hope that helps, Quentin. And feel free to follow up with me and I'll get you the link. Oh, there, Shelby behind the scenes is always a step ahead of me. There's the link to the Being Positive at Work class. All right. Yeah, Manana's learning to pick a common ground, build rapport with those hostile audiences. Shelby's had a previous work experience. The company tried to pretend there was a good change when it obviously wasn't. It was confusing and chaotic. So yeah, that again, that honesty and representation. I can't there's a silly expression that some of you may have heard. You can't put lipstick on a pig. Like I can try to beautify this thing, but if it's ugly, maybe I'm better off. And I don't want to say that pigs are ugly, because some of you are going to give me pigs are lovely comments. But yeah, there's just this idea that if it's not great, acknowledging that is sometimes important. Or one of the users, somebody earlier mentioned, when we lack credibility, it was Jay that was talking about be human. When you don't know something, when you're not an expert, it actually builds your credibility rather than hurting it, to say, here's what I do know about the situation. I don't know this. I'm not an expert on these. I think we're always hesitant to say those types of things because we worry it's going to hurt our credibility, when in actuality, that humanizes us and boosts our credibility, because we're willing to say, I'm not an expert at everything.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that connecting with those pain points, that's one of the questions that I always go back to, is in terms of don't ignore if there is a problem at hand, because that actually just builds frustration in the relationship of communication. So if there is something that needs to be addressed, or that's bothering them from a business perspective, or even just relationships perspective, being able to bring that to light so that you can address it and move forward.
Absolutely. What are those questions that you typically tick through your head on, Kathy, and say, before I walk into this meeting, before I make this presentation, before I have this conversation, this one-on-one conversation, I need to know these things? Do you have sort of a checklist of questions you use?
Yeah, I actually do. And I will say that I've adapted my questions from Nancy Duarte, who is a highly regarded communication expert. So some of you might already know some of these questions, but it's always good to kind of revisit and come back to the basics. And what you'll probably note from these questions is one of the last questions is, what do I want them to do? So as we were talking about from the beginning, I think we all sometimes can get caught up in the hustle and the bustle and the rush of what do we need to get out of this meeting, or what do we need to convey in the message. But we really should be backing that up and thinking about who our audience is and what do they need out of the meeting. So the first question is, who is your audience, right? And that's the very basic piece of it, in terms of who's going to be in the room, who are the decision makers. If it's a one-on-one meeting, or just a smaller meeting, what are the interests, psychographics, demographics of these people that might help you connect and understand what maybe they might value? And so the reason I think doing that doing that homework and finding that information is important does also relate to you. So who are you, and how can you relate to this audience in these ways? And I actually have kind of a funny story about this. And oftentimes I will work with people who just don't feel connected with a client that they have. Like I don't feel very connected with their industry or whatever it might be. And I say that's on you. Like you have to work to do the work to figure out how can you find that connection so that you can be more authentic, and so that you can feel more comfortable in that situation. And when I was working in the real estate division in terms of advertising, there was a time period where I was working very closely with real estate auctioneers. I knew nothing about real estate auctions. I grew up in the Northern Virginia, DC area, had never been to an auction a day in my life, and had my own bias and preconceived notion about auctions. And so I had to do a lot of research and digging to kind of figure out, where is this space that I'm going to connect with these auctioneers. And what I really learned in my research and my background knowledge was that a lot of these auctioneer companies were family-run businesses, had generations and generations of people who worked together in these auction companies. And I am a Cuban American woman, and my family very much values family and connection in that relationship. And so I found this connection with them immediately, which was family and the way that they approached things. And so I feel like we could develop relationships, and having a little bit more of interest in how did they get into this? Tell me, what does this mean for you and your family? And it made me develop that trust and credibility with them in a different way. So that's why kind of looking at who your audience and who you are makes a difference.
I'm not sure I've ever thought about the who am I as a part of, I think of audience. I'm looking at the other, I'm looking at the receiver end of this. Even though I know that, the sender receiver is a transactional, it's both happening all the time, but that's such a great question and such a good example of how that does end up playing into finding the common ground and finding those connection points. I love that. So we ask, who is in the audience, demographics, psychographics, interest, who am I, and where are my connection points? What else do we ask?
So this kind of goes to the friendly, neutral, hostile, and why are they here? So are they willing participants, or is this mandatory? What are their expectations? So doing that, asking that question and kind of revisiting why they're in the room or why they're in that meeting. Are they taking that meeting with you after you've hounded their administrative assistant many times to get in the door? They're going to be coming at it in a different way. You need to prepare for that in a different way than somebody who maybe called you and asked you to come meet with them. Yeah. So that why they are here. And then that goes into how much do they already know about their topic? How much do they need to know to make a decision? We don't want to overcomplicate things. People have limited time and attention spans. So really thinking about why they're here and what they already know ahead of time is also two good questions. The next kind of section I go into is what I said earlier in terms of what is their pain point or what is their problem. Everyone likes to hear how you can make their lives better. And so that feeds into how can you solve their problem? Is there anything that you have at your fingertips that can help solve their problem? And hopefully you're having that communication or that meeting because you want there to be a mutual benefit, right?
Right,
so
right.
That's clear.
I love Nancy Duarte's language on that. What keeps them up at night?
Right.
When I can figure out what's causing you to lose sleep, and then if I have something that can help resolve that, now we've got a connection point here that makes a lot of sense. And I also say, and if I don't have something that can help you, maybe I need to rethink the what I'm asking. Maybe this isn't such a great recommendation after all. If it's good for a few but bad for so many, or just I really have to think about that systemically, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. It certainly helps with the empathy piece. And like we were talking about earlier, we don't want to ignore if you're meeting with a client that has a very clear problem at hand that they've either told you or is very public, then it'd be kind of weird for you not to address it, right? So I think it helps with that empathy piece. The next couple of questions are, what is the best way to reach them? And, this means a lot of different things in terms of having an understanding of how they prefer to receive information. And sometimes you can get this from having a past relationship with them or knowing a colleague who's worked with them in the past, or maybe talking to that gatekeeper to kind of learn a little bit more about them. But I had clients in the past who were very data heavy. And then I had some clients in the past who, if we did, a mock-up of their campaign, they were just very visually inspired, right? So having an understanding of how they prefer to receive the information. In this world, that also kind of means, do they prefer a virtual meeting or an in-person meeting? Asking the questions of, are we going to be meeting in a boardroom, or will I have access to a computer? Because you don't want to show up and think you're going to be doing this PowerPoint presentation and then find out that you're in a back room with no access, right? So really asking the right questions of how do they, how is the best way to reach them, but also what are you going to have access to in general, so that you can plan accordingly. And then the last two questions is, what do you want them to do? And considering how they might resist, so that you can play a little bit of devil's advocate. And where they might give you pushback, you can either confront that in your conversations or just be prepared for a Q&A to be able to handle that.
Love it. I see Marcos has mentioned, understanding their needs, the questions that you've asked. Are any of those questions about personality specifically? He mentions a DISC model, which is a particular temperament assessment. There are others, MBTI, even knowing someone's strength through Strengths Finders, if some of you use that, or Kiersey, a version of MBTI. I think that's interesting. I think for me, I do if I've worked with someone long enough to know a little bit about their personality, it does influence how I interact with them. So for example, if I have someone, I'm not as familiar with DISC, Marco, so I can't speak to it specifically, but on the MBTI, there's a thinking and a feeling dimension, whether you process information and make decisions through sort of your head or through sort of your emotional heart space. And if I know I'm dealing with someone who's more of a thinker, I use thinking language. I'll say, well, what do you think about this? Or I think this. And if I'm dealing with someone who's more of a feeler, I use feeler language. Well, what do you feel about this? How's this sitting with you? What's your gut tell you? I use that kind of language to lean into where they already sort of reside and what resonates with them a little bit. Or if you have someone that is very direct. So for me, because I can't know someone's personality necessarily because it's inside their head and inside them, but I can base it on some of the manifestations of our personality, which are a lot of communication cues. Mm-hmm. So if I see that you tend to be very direct in your communication, you get to the point, you say what you mean what you say, there's no soften around the edges for you, then I know when I'm talking to you, I probably ought to be pretty direct. Sure. But if you tend to take a more gentle approach to a conversation, then I'm going to lean in more softly. So yeah, I do think that some of those personality or what manifests maybe as communication style, I definitely do take that into consideration as we go. One of the questions I frequently get, Kathy, is what if you have if it's a bigger audience and you've got both you've got somebody who knows a lot and you've got somebody who knows nothing about your topic. Right. You've got somebody who loves your idea and someone who hates your idea. What do you do when you've got more than one person in the room and they are not in one of those neat buckets that we talked about?
Yeah, and I'd say the vast majority of the time we are dealing with a mixed bag, especially if we're in larger audiences, that it's not super common for it to all be friendly or all be neutral, right? And there's a few schools of thought on this. In general, my instinct is to try to appeal to the audience that needs the most from me. And so I would say I'm trying to avoid isolating people or making them feel left out of the conversation. So there's ways to approach this so that you're not also patronizing the people who might already know things about that. So really just using language like some of you might already know this, or just to make sure we're all on the same page, just so that you are making sure everyone is a part of the conversation. And certainly in business, in the back of your mind, you also want to keep in mind who the decision maker is and what they need, right? So while I want to appease everyone, at the end of the day, I need to make sure the person who's making the decision has the best understanding of the information that I'm trying to give.
So true. So true. I do sometimes take a meeting before the meeting. If there's someone who I know is very resistant and is going to be completely hostile, maybe I work with them to have that plant the seeds of doubt meeting, or, that you want to move them from hostile to neutral. Maybe I can do that before the meeting. Or same way, if someone doesn't know a lot about the topic, I can say, hey, can I get 15 minutes with you to chit chat about this upcoming topic to make sure, we're all starting on the same level. Or sometimes I will enlist someone who's more knowledgeable in the meeting. So,
right.
Kathy, I know you've worked on this. You've done a ton of research on this. Maybe you could speak to it. So now instead of Kathy, who's very knowledgeable, being bored or angry that I'm speaking at a lower education knowledge level, she's my ally now. She's been looped into helping me educate others in the room. So
absolutely.
That's really helpful to me. Yep. So the basis of a lot of what we're talking about is really empathy. I mean, it's just empathize with the other person in the room, know them, tailor to them. And when we were talking about the getting ready for this program and talking about empathy, Kathy introduced me to a really interesting tool called the social identity wheel. I was wondering, Kathy, if you would share a little bit about that with the group, and then we will also in the chat put the link to this. It's a University of Michigan resource, so we'll make sure you can access this social identity wheel. So what is this and how does it help you tailor to your audience?
Sure, absolutely. And I certainly want to give credit to University of Michigan. This is where I received this wheel, and my master's is in higher education and student affairs, and so a lot of my research was based on identity development of students, but people in general, right? So one of the things that I learned was really thinking about who we are helps us to better tailor to other people. And I will say sometimes when I'm coaching or working with people with this wheel, they'll say, wait, I thought we were talking about audience analysis. Am I looking at myself? Well, really considering who we are is helpful to see maybe where some of those holes are in connecting with our audience. We are never presenting to a room of carbon copies of ourselves. So really looking at these at the social identity wheel really helps us think about maybe what we value, what drives us, identities that we might think about on a regular basis, identities that people might think about us when we walk into a room. It's just a fact that you might want to be considering in terms of what your audience might be thinking of you when you walk into a room. And when we look at all of these and consider maybe where we hold privilege and maybe things that identities we don't really have to think about often, and then identities that we think about often, that really helps us think about how we might see the world differently than others in our audience. And why does this matter? And how does this translate into communication? This matters because once we have an understanding of how we might differ from our audience, we can take action by learning more about a community or a value or even sometimes a personality that might be different than our own, so that we can get the resources that we need to make that connection and to really make sure that we are being empathetic and respectful. So if I'm working with a community that I don't identify with, then I might source one of my colleagues who does identify with that community and go through my presentation with them and say, hey, does this resonate with you? Am I using correct terminology? The last thing you want to do is offend your audience. And so really finding where our holes are really strengthens us, and it's humbling, but it also shows that we care. So doing this kind of work is actually very important.
Absolutely. A specific, maybe seems like a simplistic example, but I was working in a multinational company and had been asked to present in another country. And I recognized that my religion was different from almost everyone that would be in the room. And so I took a moment to ask someone, from that faith tradition, what are the holidays? What are what are the words, that might be trigger words from a religious or spiritual tradition? And even just knowing what holidays were coming up or had just happened made me far more attuned to the experience of my audience. And that had they just been at big family gatherings, were they actually currently fasting during the day? These kinds of things make a huge difference in how an audience can show up and how I should show up with my audience. Not to mention that it was a credibility builder in that, or a connection builder in that, oh, she's taken the time to understand us a little bit. So
Yeah,
that's
absolutely.
one of those
And
identities.
And I know you and I had talked about this a little bit offline, but it certainly helps us be a more empathetic audience member as well. Sometimes when we realize we have privilege in a room, we have more empathy for the speaker that might not. And so I mentioned to you that I'm a Cuban American woman, but I married an American. So my name is Kathy Fisher. And when I walk in the room, I appear to be white. And so I kind of have this ability to go kind of morph to different audiences that I'm with. And so I have, I think, sometimes more empathy for when a underrepresented minority is speaking and they're in a minority setting, that I want to be more attentive and make sure that I am making eye contact and affirming with my head nods and things like that. So I think really thinking about those things just it makes us better communicators all around.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, folks, this has been an incredible conversation. I'm so grateful to you, Kathy, for being here. The Learn Plus for today is your lovely social identity wheel. Again, pull that out and use that as sort of your tip sheet when you're trying to identify an audience. Work through those questions that Kathy shared with us. We'll make sure that we put those in a follow-up post about this particular session, so you have a handy resource for those questions from that she's revised from Nancy Duarte's work. And thank you all for your comments, for your great insights, and for sharing your afternoon with us. We're here to learn, and we're going to keep learning. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.